From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. An attack on Sebeka-Nakedi chief Mike Sack. The violence keeps escalating. The eyes of the nation now fixed on the wharfs and lobster pounds of southwest Nova Scotia. Mi'kmaq fishers and community members are facing violence, intimidation, and alleged arson from non-Indigenous commercial fishermen. The band is exercising the Mi'kmaq right to fish for a moderate livelihood that was affirmed by Supreme Court ruling. And commercial fishers are lashing out, blockades and shouting matches at the wharfs, a van lit on fire. The lines of lobster traps belonging to Mi'kmaq fishers have reportedly been cut. Then, in the middle of the night, a lobster pound goes up in flames. Wow. A 31-year-old man has been charged with arson, and a 46-year-old man has been charged with assault in the Chief Mike Sack incident. Mi'kmaq community members are not the only ones who say these are the acts of racist commercial fishers. Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller says that is apparent.
The acts of violence we have seen in the past days and weeks are disgusting, unacceptable, and racist in nature.
But this case is about more than fishing rights. It's about Indigenous treaties, a landmark Supreme Court ruling, and the actions of the RCMP, which is also under fire. We're talking to Pam Palmater, Mi'kmaq lawyer. She's also the professor and the chair of Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University and hosts the podcast Warrior Life. She's breaking down what's happening in Nova Scotia and the Supreme Court-backed rights of the Mi'kmaq people. Pam, thanks for taking the time to talk about this.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
You know, there's a lot to talk about this legally, racially, historically, but on a human level. I know what we're talking about is personal, too. And when you see the violence that is happening towards Mi'kmaq fishermen and members of the community, as a Mi'kmaq citizen yourself, what's been going through your mind at this time?
Well, the fact that it hits close to home, I mean, I'm always behind the scenes advocating for First Nations all over Canada and the US. But then when it keeps coming back home, it's very unsettling, especially since we're in COVID. And I can't actually go there because, Ontario is COVID central. The Atlantic bubble, or so to speak, has lower levels of COVID. So we have to be very careful in all of our organizing and what we do that we're not also providing any health risks to anyone. I find it the most difficult that I can't actually be there physically, that I have to work on this issue and try to help all the Mi'kmaq communities from behind the scenes, basically remotely.
There's a layer of complexity here that in any other time we didn't really have.
Yeah, exactly. And we have to be careful on the ground too, to make sure that, whatever it is that we're planning, all of the supports that are in place are done in a really safe way, knowing that we have many elders who have compromised immune systems and that Native people are always disproportionately impacted by all the outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics that Canada's ever had. So you've got that going on at the same time. And, I would add to that an even greater risk, the fact that the RCMP haven't been taking substantive actions to protect the safety of Mi'kmaq people. I find that as concerning as the violence that's coming from the fishers, because that's a real recipe for disaster.
This began with protests and threats from commercial fishermen who are mostly white. It led to violence against Indigenous people. An elder was pushed, a lobster pound, of course, burned down because of alleged arson. Knowing Canada's history with Indigenous peoples, did any of this surprise you?
No. And this isn't the first time that's happened either. Remember 21 years ago when we won our treaty case at the Supreme Court of Canada, what was the response? It was continued violence from these Nova Scotia fishermen and violence with impunity. So while Fisheries Notions and the RCMP were there on the ground, they literally watched as we were assaulted, our property was destroyed, threats were made. So this is just a repeat of what happened back then. And also don't forget that these Nova Scotia fishermen after we won the case, applied to the Supreme Court of Canada for a rehearing. There's no such thing as a rehearing at Supreme Court of Canada. Within Canada's system, that's the last say. And so they've never accepted that we have treaty rights here, and their violence just explodes from time to time. And the RCMP have continually failed to stop the violence or protect Mi'kmaq people. And that's a real concern.
And I wanted to talk about that Supreme Court ruling in 1999, because I think that will help listeners better understand some of the legal context of what's happening here. Going back to 1999, R.V. Marshall. So Pam, what did the Supreme Court decision say in that case, and how does it affect the Mi'kmaq people?
Well, so this was a scenario where, despite our treaties saying that we had the right to hunt, fish, gather, and bring it to trade for sale, that had always been denied by federal and provincial governments. They'd always stopped us, pretty much cut us out of our own resources, including the fishery. So Donald Marshall Jr. went fishing for eel and then sold it, but knowing that he could potentially be arrested. And it's significant. Like, listeners should understand who Donald Marshall Jr. is. Not only was he a Mi'kmaq man, but he was the same man who had been wrongfully imprisoned for 11 years when he was younger for a crime he clearly didn't commit. And there was even a royal commission into this wrongful prosecution, which found that the entire justice system, from cops, his own lawyers, to the Court of Appeal, were racist against him because he was Native.
19 years after Donald Marshall was wrongly jailed, an inquiry vindicates him. The inquiry judges conclude Donald Marshall was a victim, wrongly convicted in part because he's an Indian.
So he took great risk of bringing this case forward. So we brought the case forward. The Supreme Court of Canada confirmed, yes, the treaties of 1760 and 61 confirm that Mi'kmaq peoples have the right to hunt, fish, gather, and bring it to trade to earn what they deem to be a moderate livelihood. And a moderate livelihood includes what you would imagine it would include. You know, you can provide a house for yourself, vehicles, food, clothing, you know, any other opportunities that other Canadian families would have.
Basically sustain your life.
No, it was more than sustainability. So it wasn't bare subsistence. You got the right to have a moderate livelihood like Canadians enjoy, most Canadians enjoy. And there was no number put on that. There was no quota put on that, because that's going to be different at different times and different regions and all of that stuff. But it's important to remember that these Nova Scotia fishermen applied for a rehearing, and the Supreme Court of Canada denied them a rehearing, but said in a sort of clarification decision, something that's never been done before, basically saying that the federal government has an interest in conservation, and so they have an interest in negotiating conservation regulations in relation to the fishery. And that's never been an issue, because every Supreme Court of Canada case that's upheld our Aboriginal treaty rights said that Aboriginal rights trump every other right in the country because they're constitutionally protected. And that includes the commercial fishers, except conservation. Conservation is always the number one goal. Nobody disputes that at all. And so here you have a scenario where these Nova Scotia fishermen have never accepted that, but they've been relatively quiet because we've been denied full implementation of our rights. And it's only when we assert our rights peacefully, I might add, that they amp up the violence again.
So if I'm understanding this decision correctly, based off of the 1760 treaty, which again was upheld by the Supreme Court, aren't Mi'kmaq people the only people with an inherent right to fish in the area? I mean, commercial fishermen don't have legal claims to those waters.
Right. So nobody has any legal rights to that. They have what's known as a privilege. The privilege is granted through a licensing system by, in this case, the federal government, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, from time to time under various conditions. But that's a privilege. They don't have a right, and they don't own the resource, though they act like they own the resource and as if they have the power to stop us from fishing our own resource. It's Mi'kmaq resource. I mean, that's now constitutionally protected. There's no argument about that. Yet we're stuck on this treadmill of arguing the same thing over and over.
There were two words that you mentioned there of moderate livelihood, and that seems to be a central part of the dispute too. It's in front of Parliament, and there's been criticism that it has taken the federal government 21 years now, and that those terms have not fully been defined what moderate livelihood means, what it actually means on the ground. Can you explain how even that legal distinction is kind of hazy?
And it's also a bit of a distraction because you can have an agreement to access the fishery for food and social and ceremonial purposes, that's known as the Aboriginal fishery, or for commercial purposes where you get to engage in the commercial sale to earn a livelihood without having to specifically define moderate livelihood. Now, some people want a number put on it. They want a salary. You can only make X amount of salary, or you can only have X amount of quota. But it doesn't work that way because for conservation reasons, we always have to adjust to what's there on the ground. And we always have to take into account that there is only one group that has a constitutionally protected right to engage in a commercial fishery. So given that priority, I think it would be a bad move to try to put a specific number on it, which would change all the time. What's really needed is what they're talking about here, a nation-to-nation agreement where we agree what the relationship is going to be for Mi'kmaq people, both in terms of accessing the food, social, and ceremonial part, the commercial part, but also the joint governance of the resource. So having a say in what levels of conservation does there have to be? What is a moderate livelihood at any given time from year to year? Who gets to fish and who doesn't get to fish, and how often, and what happens with retired licenses? So this treaty right is really more than just this little tiny moderate livelihood definition that everyone's holding on to. That's not the issue. That's more of a distraction. The issue is we have the right to fish, and the Nova Scotia fishermen don't want us to fish. And that's really at the root of the problem. Anything else is a dog whistle. We know the conservation isn't an issue because we're talking about literally a couple hundred traps versus hundreds of thousands of traps and multiple commercial fishing operations who have been convicted multiple times for breaching conservation regulations. So we know it's not conservation. We also know it's not the other dog whistle around equality, because equality for these non-native fishermen means no native rights are recognized. And that's not the world we live in. It's our territory. They wouldn't be enjoying anything without the treaties that were made. And so that's the legal reality in this country. And I think we need to keep it focused on what's happening here. It's racist violence. And according to the ministers, it's also terrorism.
We'll be right back. In writing about this, you wrote a piece about the legal dispute and also the reaction by the state, by both the provincial and federal governments. And you called this a failure of the rule of law by both governments. What do you mean by that?
Well, look at what happens anytime Native peoples peacefully assert their land rights or their rights to protect waters or, hunting, fishing, any of our rights. What happens? The RCMP or the OPP or someone moves in and the first words out of their mouth is, we have no choice but to arrest all these Native people. We're just abiding by the so-called rule of law. But yet, here we are, we're actually operating this fishery according to the rule of Canada's own law. You've got non-native fishermen engaging in serious acts of criminality, arson, violence, assaults, and they're not being addressed. And so which laws get applied and by whom and according to what interpretation? And when you don't prioritize these constitutional rights, you are literally violating Canada's system, which is based entirely, the foundation of it is on constitutional law. And so they're violating their own rule of law.
By failing to uphold the law, there is no law then.
Yeah, well, you've got on the one hand, RCMP who over-arrest, brutalize, and kill Indigenous peoples at alarming rates. They're the first on the scene with SWAT teams and snipers and armed vehicles to stop us from exercising our rights. Yet on the other hand, when our lives are in danger from these non-native fishermen, they literally stand around. I mean, we've been watching for a month on social media, videos from everyone posting with RCMP, literally watching while vans are burned, threats are made, assaults are happening. And that also explains things like why we have murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. RCMP are nowhere to be found to protect us. So there's a real disconnect between what laws they uphold and what they don't. And it's based, sadly, in these racist ideologies that Indigenous peoples and rights don't matter, and they will protect the status quo as much as possible.
You also wrote a line that I think is rooted in our history in Canada and seems so central to what we're talking about here. And you said, and I don't want to get it wrong, so I'm quoting it, "The lives of Indigenous peoples have long been considered both exploitable and expendable in the name of private property." In this case in Nova Scotia, is this a pretty clear example of that to you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in every sense of the word. I mean, look at what happened in Saskatchewan when Gerald Stanley, at point blank range, shot and killed an unarmed Native youth. And then all of these farmers said, well, we have the right to defend our property.
Today, inside this courtroom, we finally heard from Gerald Stanley. He is the farmer accused of killing Colton Bushy, and he testified today that the gun accidentally went off.
We stand justice for Colton Bushy. This ain't right, this ain't justice, and the law system failed my family in this murder trial.
How ironic that Native lands are being considered private property. And then secondly, that our lives are so undervalued that they would rather kill a person than maybe have a tractor stolen, if that's the issue. And here in this case, these fishers are shown they're willing to burn people down in order to protect what they believe to be their private property, but isn't their private property. It's Mi'kmaq property. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that Mi'kmaq people were doing things that were hurting the fish stock. That still doesn't justify burning them down, assaulting them, and taking matters into your own hands. That's against the law.
Actual acts of violence, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. The RCMP point that you bring up is so interesting because I think that's where a lot of the criticism has landed as well in terms of the handling of this case. You know, you mentioned the photos and the videos, eyewitnesses too, who say RCMP officers have just been observing. They did not intervene when non-Mi'kmaq fishers were raiding a lobster compound. A Nova Scotia RCMP spokesperson said that this unrest is, quote, not a police issue, and that the officers also, quote, understand both sides. When you hear that being the response of the RCMP, what do you make of that?
So A, they've just admitted that they're not doing their job. Oh, this isn't a policing issue. So then why are you there? Just kind of hanging out and watching what happens? Are you there supporting the non-native fishers? And then to say that they understand the passions of the non-native fishers. I'm sorry, but these people are engaged in potentially life-threatening violent crimes that may also fall under the category of terrorism under the criminal code. To say that you understand their passions, that's incredible. When have we ever heard the RCMP ever say that about us when we're peacefully asserting our rights or peacefully defending our territories? And, you know, Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair, was pushed on that at the press conference. And people said, hey, what about what this Nova Scotia RCMP was saying? And he was like, he might have misspoken. He didn't misspeak. He said exactly what Nova Scotia RCMP feel, and this has been their attitude for decades.
There's also an argument that some journalists have also made that this is false objectivity, that you have one side that is now charged with assault and arson, and there's another side that at this point have not committed any criminal acts, and again, has a legal right to fish in the area.
Yeah, exactly. It's when you categorize this as a dispute, or Minister Bill Blair called both sides combatants, as if we were in some kind of war over the lobster. And that just really does a gross injustice to what's happening. The Mi'kmaq people, despite all the violence and threats, continue to remain peaceful, and we don't return the violence. And when asked about that, you know, Senator Murray Sinclair, he said, oh, this isn't about a dispute. This is one-sided acts of terrorism on the part of the non-native fishers. And that's something that was confirmed by Minister Mark Miller, Minister of Indigenous Services. He actually, at the same press conference, countered what Minister Blair said about, the RCMP are doing their job. Minister Mark Miller said, well, in fact, they're not doing their job. They've grossly disappointed Indigenous peoples. They've failed to protect them.
Once again, as evidenced by the scenes of violence, Indigenous people have been let down by the police, those who are sworn to protect them.
And I think that's the truth that needs to be told.
There's also increasingly more reporting about this that is capturing national attention. And of the reporting that you've seen, I almost sort of want to turn it inwards as well, because media has a responsibility here. What do you think journalists and reporters are missing the mark on, or perhaps not understanding about what's happening here?
I think there's several problems, and it's hit and miss. You can have the same media outlet do one story and frame it perfectly, but then at the 6 o'clock hour, the 7 o'clock hour, the 8 o'clock hour, they revert back to categorizing this as some kind of war between two parties. I think media has to be very careful about not just mimicking what everybody else is saying. So if all the mainstream media is calling this a conflict, a dispute, a war, why would you just copy that for the sake of copying it? Look into it deeper. Listen to the press conference of all of these ministers who are saying all of the violence is coming from one side. And it's the same, don't just repeat what the RCMP say or what the Nova Scotia fishermen say. You know, they're going on and on and on about conservation. Well, it's been clarified by DFO, by biologists, by all the fish scientists, and now Minister Miller, that this is not a matter of conservation, that it is absolutely impossible for this fraction of 1% of the fishery to have any impact on the stocks compared to the commercial fishery. So I think it's incumbent to do due diligence and dig deeper. We're in an age of reconciliation, and the media has played a huge role in demonizing Indigenous peoples in the past. And that's a form of public miseducation. And the public will just literally mimic what the media is saying. And it ends up being almost like subliminal messaging unless you dig deeper. Now, I fully understand within a 2-minute spot or a 1-minute spot, you can't cover all of the context, but you can be responsible in how you present it. Like saying the Mi'kmaq allege they have a treaty right. It's not an allegation. It's been proven in the Supreme Court of Canada. So don't cast doubt on it or ask, is there systemic racism in Canada? Those things have long been settled.
Yeah.
Ask better, more informed questions.
Right. We are long past that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is this moment? Some of the conversations about the rights of Indigenous peoples that have sprung from this case, what does it tell you about where Canada actually is in 2020 on reconciliation?
It's not. That it has jumped onto the superficial acts. You know, we're going to change Indian affairs to Aboriginal affairs, and now we're changing it to Indigenous affairs. We're going to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. You know, we're going to take selfies and show up and do speeches at meetings. But ultimately, where are they on land, water, resources, and sovereignty? What significant advancements have they made? And they haven't. And, you know, I feel like a broken record on this, but let's just look at socioeconomic conditions on every single level, whether it be incarceration, foster care, murdered and missing, education, health levels. All of the statistics continue to get worse. So whatever it is they're doing isn't working, and they need to look beyond that, beyond these programs and initiatives and kind words, and actually get at the heart of the matter. And the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls said, you know what? Canada's guilty of genocide. It's ongoing, and they need to start there with ensuring that the human rights of Native peoples are respected. And it's not. And Canada's not even at a place where it's willing to admit some of the problems. I mean, look at the RCMP. They're still in complete denial about, the forms that systemic racism takes. So we've got a long ways to go.
Pam, thank you for taking the time to talk to us about this.
Well, thank you for covering it. I think it's really important that you include lots of voices, voices of people on the ground, Indigenous women's voices, outside of the usual political sphere. I think it's important to capture what's really happening.
Absolutely. That's Pam Palmater, Mi'kmaq lawyer and the Chair of Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University. And an update since we recorded this interview, on October 21st, a Nova Scotia Supreme Court judge granted an injunction to the Sipekne'katik band members, which legally prevents anyone from getting in the way of the First Nations lobster fishing activities. The RCMP says it will enforce the injunction. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mutar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.